I'll never forget the exact second everything changed. It wasn't the security escort or the HR packet with transition printed in bold across the top. It was that single word, ma'am, stretched out slow and dripping with pity, like I was some confused grandmother who'd wandered into the wrong meeting. We were in the main conference room at Helix Innovations headquarters outside Cleveland, going over final compliance for the Helix core rollout to major U.S. utility partners. I had just finished walking the team through the layered IP shielding structure, how the core compression patents remained in the legacy trust until the bilateral consent form received both signatures and my active employee status was verified. Simple, airtight language I'd drafted myself years earlier. Derek Lang leaned back in the leather chair, flashed that perfect white smile the board loved, and said, "Thanks, ma'am. But I think we've got it from here. Let the new generation handle the details now." The room erupted in polite chuckles. I didn't laugh. That condescending drawl landed like a slap. In that moment, I understood. He didn't just underestimate me. He genuinely believed the foundation of this company was replaceable. 32 years. I started in 1993 when Helix was still operating out of a converted auto parts warehouse in an industrial park near Akron. I was the only woman in the entire engineering group for the first 9 years. I didn't demand credit or raise my voice. I simply stayed later, documented more meticulously, and outlasted every loud young man who swore I'd never last. I was the one who spotted the critical loophole in the original thermal to electrical conversion filing that beat a major California competitor by less than 24 hours. That single patent kept us alive through the dot-com crash and the 2008 financial meltdown. They used to call me the quiet engine, never as a compliment. It was their shorthand for she won't yell, but she'll never let you cut corners either. I learned early that in this industry, people ignore the fine print until the moment it costs them everything. So when we began serious development of the Helix core in 2012, variable state energy compression with onboard adaptive load balancing, I insisted we route everything through a dedicated legacy trust. Not for personal control, for protection. The technology was revolutionary. If it ever left our hands unsecured, licensing violations could sink the company overnight. My intention had always been to transfer full ownership once final regulatory clearance came through. But nobody ever circled back for the signatures. They were too busy chasing the next funding round, the next press release, the next disruptive hire. Derek arrived like a hurricane 2 years ago, armed with every Silicon Valley buzzword: agility, decentralization, rapid iteration. He gutted the historical R&D archive I had personally curated, 900 gigabytes of prototype logs, failed experiments, and version histories, calling it digital decluttering. When I asked whether he had reviewed the full patent lineage for the Helix core, he waved a hand and said, "That's what we pay specialists for." I was those specialists. The calendar invite arrived with no agenda, organizational refresh, CEO office. I already knew. Derek's assistant gave me the pitying half-smile as I passed her desk, the kind reserved for people who are about to become past tense. 32 years in that building. And this was how they chose to do it. He had his script ready. "You've contributed enormously, Elena, but we need to accelerate. The board supports a fresh direction. Perhaps a consulting arrangement down the road." I closed my laptop, folded my hands, and said nothing. Because I already knew what he didn't. The moment I walked out that door, Helix Innovations would no longer legally own its most valuable asset. The technology underpinning their $950 million valuation, the same technology they bragged about at every investor dinner, was still sitting safely inside the Voss Legacy Trust. And the transfer document had never been signed. I offered a small, calm smile. "I appreciate the honesty, Derek." Then I left my badge on the polished conference table and walked out without another word. The storm was only beginning. That afternoon, I cleared my desk in under 40 minutes. One cardboard box. A framed photo of the original 1990s team soldering circuit boards by hand. A faded certificate from the 2007 National Engineering Excellence Awards. And the thick folder of unsigned Helix Core Trust transition drafts. Everything else, books, company mugs, decades of accumulated loyalty, stayed behind. Symbols mean nothing once the building forgets your name. I paused for a moment outside the server room on my way to the exit. The low, steady hum of racks that had run 24/7 for decades felt like breathing. Unassuming. Reliable. Just like the work I had done. They thought the quiet engine had finally been switched off. They had no idea I still held the master switch. I drove home through the old industrial corridor, past the boarded-up warehouse where we built the very first Helix Core prototype. I still remembered the exact spark when the load-balancing algorithm finally stabilized. The whole team had cheered like kids on Christmas morning. That moment had been worth more than any bonus or title they later handed out. My apartment was quiet except for the soft click of my cat Luna jumping onto the kitchen counter to inspect me. She sensed the shift immediately. I made tea. No celebration. No tears, just the same routine I had kept for years. The phone stayed silent that first evening. But I knew the silence wouldn't last. The next morning arrived with 207 missed calls before sunrise. Voicemail full. Legal extensions. Operations managers trying to sound calm while failing. Even a few Washington, D.C. area codes that could only mean federal energy partners realizing their entire deal was suddenly floating without clear title. Then Victor Hale's name appeared, the founder himself. Semi-retired, but still holding significant board sway. He had built Helix out of pure stubbornness and borrowed money in the early 90s. We weren't friends. Exactly. But we shared something rarer. Institutional memory. He was one of the few left who remembered how many times the company had nearly collapsed and how my meticulous documentation had quietly held it together. His voicemail was short and uncharacteristically direct. Elena, why does the trust dashboard still list you as sole custodian of the Helix Core family? I let him wait 5 full minutes before returning the call. Morning, Victor. They're telling me the transfer never finalized. It didn't. Why the hell not? There's a clause, I said, sipping from my favorite chipped mug. Final ownership transfers only upon mutual notarized consent and verified active employment status at the time of execution. I was still holding the documents for final regulatory clearance when you brought Derek in. So sign it now. I'm no longer an employee, Victor. Dead silence on the line. He understood immediately. That clause wasn't hidden. I had written it in clear, bold text on page 3 of the original 2016 development agreement, exactly where no one could later claim trickery. Every iteration of the Helix Core, from pre-prototype sketches through every FDA-equivalent energy regulatory checkpoint, had been registered under the Voss Legacy Trust for safekeeping. Standard practice, they had said at the time. Protection until everything cleared. Nobody had ever revisited it. Victor exhaled heavily. They'll offer you something, equity. A fat consulting contract. Maybe even a board seat. I'm not interested in charity. Another pause. We both knew the real stakes. The company's golden goose. The technology that justified their entire valuation was still legally mine. Not figuratively. Not emotionally. Legally because I had documented everything. By 10 a.m., the tone of my inbox had shifted from frantic to cautious. Phrases like seeking clarification on custodial chain and wondering if you might have capacity for a brief discussion. I ignored them all. At 11:12 a.m., board member I hadn't spoken to in 6 years sent a single line. Is this salvageable? I didn't reply. What they were really asking wasn't legal. It was whether I would quietly forgive 32 years of being treated as legacy clutter the moment it became inconvenient. I made a simple grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, the same kind I used to eat at my desk during late-night prototype sessions. They had never truly owned the invention. They had only ever borrowed it, assuming I would always be there to hand over the keys. The panic spread in ripples. A misworded bullet point appeared in the licensing FAQ. A compliance officer sent a frantic Slack message asking about historical custodial definitions. An investor relations email leaked internally questioning why the IP registration still listed the Voss Legacy Trust instead of Helix Innovations. Then the real fracture appeared, an internal memo marked clarification needed, Section 4.2, that quietly admitted the original development agreement required bilateral notarized consent for any assignment of proprietary developments. No such consent had ever been executed. Derek's carefully cultivated image as the visionary savior began to crack. His executive spotlight interview with industry press was suddenly postponed. Internally, they rewrote the narrative to downplay the Helix core centrality, just a little too late. The valuation models everyone had seen for 3 funding rounds all prominently featured the projected $950 million in exclusive U.S. licensing revenue. They sent a bridge first, a polished senior partner from their outside counsel firm who called himself a facilitator. We met at a quiet cafe near the old university lab, where we had once run early simulations on borrowed graduate equipment. He opened with the generous reinstatement package. Full executive title, rebuilt division, retroactive equity, going back a decade, even a public acknowledgement of my contributions. Derek would step back from IP matters entirely. They would issue a joint statement framing it as a strategic partnership renewal. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I slid a single-page proposal across the table. Exclusive 5-year license for the entire Helix core patent family. Market rate royalties benchmarked to independent third-party valuation. Quarterly usage reporting. No sublicensing without written consent. Any violation triggers immediate termination. Custodial ownership remains permanently with the Voss Legacy Trust. He scanned it twice, then looked up genuinely confused. No discount? You built this with them. I built the core before they understood what it was. They funded later phases. The foundational IP was mine. He cleared his throat. Victor was hoping for something that reflects long-term partnership. So was I 3 weeks ago. Before my name was scrubbed from every project directory and I was labeled a liability. Silence. He asked the obvious next question. Are you planning to license this elsewhere? I already have 2 mid-size clean energy startups and 1 academic consortium, all non-exclusive, non-competing niches. The rate adjusts upward and becomes non-exclusive if Helix does not secure the premium package before the Houston Energy Innovation Summit next quarter. He nodded slowly, not in agreement but in recognition that the mathematics had fundamentally changed. Their flagship technology was now sitting on land they no longer owned. Power didn't shift in the boardroom with dramatic speeches. It shifted in that small cafe, with 1 calm page of terms and a woman who no longer needed their permission. The Houston Summit Hall hummed with the particular electricity that only combines serious money and fragile egos. Suits, large screens, translators, the low murmur of future contracts being negotiated in real time. When the moderator announced the IP sovereignty in emerging energy storage panel and read my name, Dr. Elena Voss, chairman of the Voss Legacy Trust, the room temperature changed. Heads turned. Phones came out. Several executives who had casually dismissed me weeks earlier suddenly realized they had missed a critical detail in their pre-read packets. I wasn't introduced as former Helix employee or independent consultant. I was introduced as chairman of the trust that owned the foundational patents the entire industry now relied upon. Helix had wired the 7-figure exclusivity fee at the last possible moment to secure their position before the summit opened. Publicly, they called it a renewed strategic partnership. Privately, I learned later, they rewrote their entire IP governance policy overnight, adding inventor consent checklists, mandatory clause training for executives, and historical audit requirements. All the years they had mocked process as the enemy, and now they were erecting monuments to the very documentation they had discarded. I didn't gloat. I simply laid out, calmly and precisely, how proper custodial trusts could actually accelerate innovation rather than hinder it, provided the original architects were respected rather than erased. I spoke about embedded compliance as a feature, not a bug, about how treating veteran engineers as disposable created exactly the kind of legal exposure we were all now watching play out in real time. Derek sat 3 rows back, flanked by legal and PR, face frozen in a polite rictus. He asked no questions. He didn't even blink when the moderator referred to me as the architect of modern energy storage custody standards. Afterward, a small crowd gathered. Some offered genuine handshakes. Others pitched quietly. One senior VP from a competing firm leaned in and whispered, "You just made every one of us go back and read our own damn contracts." I smiled slightly. That was the point. Victor caught my eye across the room and gave a single tight nod, the kind that acknowledges a permanent shift in the balance of power. On the balcony, overlooking the convention center lights, new meeting requests flooded in, federal energy boards, academic consortia, even cautious inquiries from former competitors who suddenly wanted to explore alignment rather than acquisition. They all used the same careful language now, because they finally understood what Helix had learned the hard way. You do not write off the quiet woman who kept the lights on for 3 decades. The first quarterly license payment arrived by courier in a thick cream envelope bearing the Helix Innovations logo. Inside was the wire confirmation, a sterile but impeccably polite letter from legal, and the actual check made payable to the Voss Legacy Trust. There was something quietly satisfying about seeing my name printed at the top of a check from the same company that had once tried to erase it entirely. Their public valuation held for now. Markets care about whether the technology works, not who technically owns the paper. But internally, everything had changed. Board members knew. Legal knew. The investors who mattered knew. The crown jewel they had once claimed as company property was now officially rented, quarter by quarter, from the very person they had shown the door. I never raised my voice. I never leaked documents. I never granted a single interview seeking vindication. I simply let the paperwork do the talking. In the quarters that followed, I signed 3 additional non-exclusive licenses in adjacent sectors. One European clean energy infrastructure firm opened our first call by saying, "We studied your clause architecture. It's surgical. We'd like to model our entire IP governance on it." Helix had inadvertently taught the industry 2 lessons. First, how easy it is to dismiss quiet legacy talent. Second, how expensive it becomes to rent it back. People sometimes ask whether I feel guilty licensing to competitors. The answer is no. This was never revenge. I never sabotaged them, never leaked proprietary data, never gloated in public. I simply preserved the unbroken chain of custody, the renewal confirmations, the time-stamped filings, the clear legal trail that proved ownership had never transferred. While others built empires on assumptions and momentum, I had built foundations in ink and notarized paper. Every quarter the company that once erased my name now writes it at the top of a check. Every industry conference now cites the very custodial framework they once called overly rigid. And every new agreement I sign under terms I control is a quiet reminder. Some power doesn't need volume. Some legacies don't require applause. When it is written, signed, and held in your own hand, they don't just remember you. They report to you.